good morning, good afternoon, whatever. I don't know what time is it in your country. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Thomas Piketty. And my task today is quite easy because everybody knows who Thomas is. But maybe today I won't take time to present all the great books that Thomas has written. I will only take a few seconds to try to explain to which extent, and I don't know if Thomas agrees with me, to which extent Thomas' work is part of the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, the EHESS in Paris. And I just want to say that maybe Thomas' works are part of the École in two ways. One is the strong interdisciplinary element in Thomas' work. And I'm not sure, and you're better than me in economics, but I'm not sure that in many places in the world, you have such a dialogue between economists and other social scientists. Let me just take one example of Thomas' work, and you always work with historians. And that's something, I won't say that it's unique to the École, but it's something that shapes your work in many different ways. In your recent book, I mean, you use, for instance, Quentin de Luyermo's counterfactual notion to bring a different story to the story one usually knows about inequality. So I think that's something that is part of the EHESS tradition, and that's something that is quite interesting with your own work, and maybe it's something that shapes Thomas' view of social sciences. The other part is that the way you try to write books that are going to shape public policy, not in an expert way. I mean, bringing some expertise to politicians, but what you try to do, and I think that's part of the EHESS tradition. You try to bring new questions, new ways of saying social words, economists, social sciences in the country, and to use that for something that is relevant for the whole population. And your work is so important that it's not relevant for France, but for many countries. So I'm very happy to have you here today. Just for participants to this panel, what we are going to do is I will give the floor to Thomas in a few seconds. You will speak for 1 hour or something, 45 minutes or something. And then we will turn to questions. So you can either put your questions write your questions in the chat, or I can give you time to ask them directly to Thomas after Thomas' presentation. So thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Romain, and hello to everybody. Let me first apologize for the fact that my English, is going to sound a lot like French to many of you, and is not as good as Romain, who's an expert in American history, and I still hope that you can understand what I have to say. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the subject of inequality regime of global history. So I don't know if you can put the slides on, or what we need to do to share the slides, but let me say, as Romain was saying, that there's a long tradition at EHESS of study in economic and social history. As you may know, Fernand Braudel, who was one of the great founders of EHESS, of course, was probably one of the greatest economic and social historian of the previous century. And so there is also this long tradition of interdisciplinarity. I think this is really one of the only places in the world where historians, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, political scientists, etc., listen to one another. In particular, we elect together our colleagues, which forces people at the very least, to listen to what the new people are, the new work is about, and I think this is really great. And this is something that's unfortunately missing in some other institutions or part of the world. So today I'm going to talk to you about inequality regime, a global history. So let me start right away, if I can. Yes. So, I'm going to talk. So I'm going to follow these slides, which I hope you can see. I assume everybody can see this. So, I'm going to talk about my research and teaching at EHESS, and especially about one of my master courses, which is called Introduction to Economic History, Capital Inequality Growth. I should say, all the slides that I'm going to use are available online. And there are links to each of these slides to the different material, which I'm sure we'll be able to put online in the context of this EHESS Spring Talks, and you will be able to look at this material again and a lot more materials than what I'm going to be able to present today. So generally speaking, my research and teaching at EHESS focuses upon the study of what I refer to as inequality regime, which I use this term to describe the set of institutional device and also political justification aiming to reproduce, justify the structure of social inequality within a given society. So this is a field of study which is by nature very much interdisciplinary, which belongs both to economic and social history and to political economy. And at the frontier between these two fields, my teachings, research seminars attempt to propose an introduction to this field of study as I see it, and to put an historical and comparative perspective, the analysis and diversity of current inequality regimes. So of course, this is both an academic field of study and very much, very hot and contested and controversial issues in today's societies all around the world. And I will use some illustration about this later, for instance, about post-colonial society, post-slavery societies, which are issues which of course are very, very important in public discussion today. So, Introduction to Economic History, which is a part of my teaching on which I will base this presentation. I should say that it's usually taken as a first-year master course, but this can also be attended as a second-year master course. The general objective is to present a general introduction to economic history with special emphasis on the interaction between capital accumulation, inequality and power regime, and economic growth and economic development. I also have other teaching at EHESS, for those of you who are interested to see, the whole set of sort of courses and seminars in which my work at EHESS takes place. In particular, students wishing to specialize in economic history are very strongly encouraged to attend an optional second-year master course, which we call Advanced Economic History, which is actually taught jointly with Facundo Alvaredo, Jérôme Bourdieu, Denis Cognot, Lionel Kestelbaum, Eric Monet, Pierre-Cyril Hocker, other people which I forget here. So there's a whole group in economic history where we all teach part of this class and try to illustrate advanced research topics. I also teach more theoretical economic concept in the public economics course, which is really for students with a special interest in the history, theory of optimal taxation, redistribution, wishing to specialize in public economics. And this is a course that I jointly teach with Antoine Bozio and Julien Grenet. Let me also mention that I also organize 3 research seminars which take place every week for the Applied Economics Seminar and the Economic History Seminar, and every 2 weeks or so for what we call the Debates on Equality, which is a set of conferences where students and faculty members come and present typically new books in the social sciences, which sort of contribute to renew the thinking and research about social equality and inequality, broadly speaking. I should mention that for now on, all these seminars are taking place, of course, online, and so some of you may be interested to have a look, next week or the following week. I don't know to which extent we'll be able to keep this online feature through some hybrid form of teaching and seminars in the future. I very much hope that we'll be able to do that, but at least in the meantime, for the weeks to come and months to come, you are most welcome to attend to these various seminars. So coming back to what I want to talk about today, which is mostly this courses on economic history and what I refer to as inequality regime. So as I said, it's really a general introduction to economic history, but with a special emphasis in particular on the history of inequality regime. So broadly speaking, what are the big questions? The big questions are, the following. How did the world distribution of output, income, wealth, both between and within countries evolve in the long run? And how can we account for these changes? What is the interaction with the global ownership and power structure, colonization and the state formation process? How do inequality regime, property regime, political system jointly evolve over time? And what is the interaction between rising inequality, financial crisis, the changing structure of political conflict? So of course, these are very broad questions, and in this class and in my work, I try to report on the little progress we've been making on these big questions. In terms of general methodology, the general question, and answers that I try to illustrate in this in my work, can be phrased as follows. Can we properly understand, economic issues or economic history issues with, formal economic models, typically representative agent models that most of the economics profession is using? And the general answer is no. We need to look at history, society, institutions, legal system, property regime, welfare state, progressive taxation. And I will provide you some example of the enormous historical change in income distributions that we see over time across societies, which you will never be able to explain with purely economic factors and economic mechanism alone. You need to put politics, social forces, social struggles, the design of institution, the transformation of ideology at the center of the picture. If you want to understand just the transformation of what we see, just from a descriptive viewpoint, if you want to understand the diversity of settings that we observe, you need to do that. And if you want to understand institutions, state formation, you also need to look at ideology, belief system about what's a fair economy, what's a just society. And so ideas and ideology are part of the study of economic history and cannot be, you cannot separate cultural, ideological history on the one hand and purely economic or social history on the other hand. And generally speaking, what I'm trying to illustrate in my work and teaching is that formal economic models, can be useful sometimes and even indispensable, but only if they are used with parsimony. Just a little bit of theoretical model when you really need them can be useful. Unfortunately, very often, economists tend to do the opposite, which is that they have very little empirical or historical material, and sometimes actually no empirical or historical material at all, and use an enormous quantity of theoretical models. So you have to inverse the ratio, and I'm trying to illustrate that economics, political economy, economic history, no matter how you want to call this, belong to the social sciences and should never have tried to escape from that. So I'm going to illustrate this a little bit more. Again, if you want to have a better sense of the kind of research in economic history, public economics related areas that I have been supervising over the years, you can look online on this. So there are links on these slides. I have put online the full set of master theses and PhD dissertation in PDF format that I have been supervising for the past 20 years at HESS. So you have a dozen of master theses and PhD dissertation. You can also have a look at the members of the Center in Economic History, which I was referring to earlier, and the World Inequality Lab, which is a laboratory which maintains the World Inequality Database an historical database on income, wealth, and inequality, which I use a lot in my teaching. This is, by the way, an ongoing collective project. We are constantly adding new countries, new historical periods on which we thought we didn't have any data, and then some students or researchers come with some new findings, and we are very happy to incorporate it to the database. So, don't hesitate, if you want to participate. What I'm going to do in the rest of this presentation is first, I'm going to give you a quick roadmap of the lectures and topics that I cover in my teaching and research, and then I will show you a number of substantial findings and graph and data, so as to illustrate, the kind of method and results that I get. So I start this teaching on inequality regime by talking in lecture 1 about the development, state formation, inequality in the long run, looking at the transition from what I call ternary societies based on nobility, clergy, third estate, to proprietarian societies, in particular after the French Revolution, but more generally in many European countries. Lecture 2 look at a number of European variants, in particular Britain and Sweden. So Sweden is a very interesting example because Sweden is a typical example of a country which we view today as very egalitarian, like, a country which seemed to be a social democratic country forever. But in fact, until 1910, Sweden is one of the most inegalitarian countries in Europe, and it's also probably the most sophisticated in its way of organizing inequality. The sense that you have an electoral system in Sweden until 1910, where, first, only the top 20% voters can vote, and male voters can vote, but that's very common in the 19th century all across Europe. In Sweden, it's until 1910, which is quite late in the day. But the real originality is elsewhere. This is that within this top 20% of voters, you can have between 1 vote or 100 votes, depending on how wealthy you are, which is quite original because, like in France or Britain in the 19th century, if you belong to the top groups, you have 1 vote, and bottom groups, you have 0 vote, and that's it. Or at some point in France, between 1815 and 1830, you had a double vote for the really top group, but it didn't go further than this. In Sweden, you have up to 100 votes. And in fact, in municipal elections, there's no maximum. So you have several dozen municipalities in Sweden until 1910, where only 1 individual has more than half of the vote and is therefore, the perfectly legal dictator. And even corporations had the right to vote in municipal election in Sweden until 1910 on the basis of the capital and tax and properties that they had in the municipality. So, this is something which large multinationals today would love to have, but they don't even dare to ask for that. So, sometimes they find other ways to get the same outcome. But what's very interesting with this example in Sweden is that it sort of illustrates, first, the imagination of societies and also the imagination of the elite and dominant class, to organize power for their purpose, but also the fact that nothing is frozen, nothing is given forever. And it's very striking in the case of Sweden, our very strong trade union mobilization and social, mobilization by the Social Democratic Party not only imposed universal suffrage in the early 1920s, but took power in 1932 and put this state capacity to the service of a completely different project. So the Social Democrats won power in 1932, stayed in power until pretty much 2006, with a few exceptions. And it's not that they've put in place a perfect society, but as compared to the previous Swedish society and pretty much every other society, they put in place a much more equal access to education, health, than other available societies. And they did it by using, in effect, the same state apparatus that was constructed in the first place, where you had registries on property taxation, which were used to distribute voting rights in proportion to how much you own. And then they used them, but for completely different purposes, which was to make people pay very high progressive tax on the basis. So what this illustrates, and that's a general theme in my teaching, is that state capacity, is not egalitarian or inegalitarian in itself. It really depends on who controls the state, which is pretty obvious in a way, but this this illustrates pretty clearly how far this can go. So it really depends on the construction of strong state power can really be used in very different manners. The following lecture 3-4, deal with slave societies, slave abolition, and I will talk a little bit about this more in a minute. I won't have time to talk about the topics covered in lecture 4, in particular about India and how the caste system in India, which is obviously enough one of the most extreme inequality regime in history, but was very much transformed and to a large extent rigidified by British colonization, was sort of put into the boxes of a modern census system, categories which before British colonization, were not particularly egalitarian, obviously, but were much less rigid than what they have become following colonization. And so if you want to understand the particular structure of inequality and the discussion about caste and quota and reservation, positive discrimination in India today, it's very important to put the study of India into both this perspective of an ancient society with status-based inequality and the impact of colonization as well. And then the second part of this teaching, looks at the transformation of inequality in the 20th century from proprietarian to social democratic societies, looks also at post-communist countries, and finally, as a big part on party system and political cleavages, which I won't have time to talk much about in this presentation, although maybe a little bit at the end if I can. I'm going to illustrate some of the findings in a minute. Let me say, in terms of reading list, my teaching is based on a large number of references. I use a lot my recent book, Capital and Ideology, which was published in French 2 years ago and in English last year. I also use a number of standard references in economic history, probably the book by Ken Pomeranz, The Great Divergence, published in 2000, probably one of the most important book, or maybe the most important book on sort of world economic history since the book of Brodel, in many ways. The book of Pomeranz is sort of more global because it sort of takes the central issue of why Europe as compared to China or Japan and managed to first develop, and Pomeranz, as some of you probably know, made very strongly the case that until 1700, 1750, the most advanced region of Western Europe, China and Japan, were very similar in the kind of sort of proto-industrial manufacturing growth, and it was really largely the colonial process starting in 1750, 1800, which sort of allowed European state powers to organize the world division of labor and the world division of in particular, the empire of cotton, which has been studied recently by Sven Beckert, which in a way is very much in the continuation of this work by Pomeranz. So these are materials that I use a lot in my class. I also use other material, including some work done by a number of colleagues at EHESS, like Mathieu Arnoux, who is a medieval historian, who has done very interesting work on the end of forced labor and the sort of unification of labor status in medieval Europe and France in particular, which I use in lecture 1, a very interesting work by Ralph Blofarb on the French Revolution, which I also use. Some of the work on Sweden, which I referred to earlier, is due to Erik Bengtsson, in particular this article in Past and Present 2019, the Swedish Sonderberg in question, which I sort of summarized some of the findings earlier, which I strongly recommend to you, which is really a very, very interesting finding. I use some of my own work with Gilles Postel-Vinet and Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, where we collected a lot of historical material in the French inheritance archives. So, the French Revolution did not create, of course, a perfectly equal society, but at least it created an observatory of wealth through the registration of the transmission of property at wealth, which is almost unique in the world, possibly with Sweden through a different historical process. But in Britain or the US, you really need to wait quite late in the 19th century or even early 20th century to have a unified system of registration of property transmission. And even today in the US, well, Omar will know that much better than me, you have this incredible diversity across the different US states and the way inheritance is registered, inheritance is taxed. So anyway, to make a long story short, in France, you can study starting in 1807 and around the time of the French Revolution, the inheritance records have been well preserved and can be digitized in the archives, which we have been doing for a very long time with my colleagues, Gilles Postel-Vinet, who is also at EHESS, but now retired, and Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, who's at Caltech. I also use some work on slave societies, colonial societies, work by Nick Draper and a group of colleagues at University College London History Department, who have looked a lot at the end of slave ownership in Britain and the compensation that were paid to slave owners. So there was no compensation to slaves; there was huge compensation to slave owners. The similar material is currently being exploited in the French case, but has not so far been exploited as much as in the British case. I use work by Nicolas Barrère, who is another of our colleagues here at EHESS, who has written this fantastic book on the political economy of Reconstruction after the US Civil War, which I really strongly recommend. And I use some work by my colleague Denis Cognot with Yannick Dupras, Sandrine Mélécomte. I've worked on fiscal capacity and dualism in colonial state, and in particular, I've used a lot recently the budgetary archives of the French colonial state, and I will give you an illustration of this in a minute about French Algeria. Let me, accelerate a little bit because I don't want to be too fast, but lecture 4, where I talk about India, I use a lot of work, in particular the books by Dirks and Bailey, are still some of the best books on the sort of modern making of the caste system in India through the impact of colonialism, which there will be a lot more to say about this, but I'm not going to do it. Okay, and then when I look at the 20th century reduction of inequality, I stress in particular the role of change in the legal system, labor regime, particularly the rise of trade union and labor law and co-determination in the case of Germany, and this work by Ewan McCaughey, the history of German corporate and labor law is particularly interesting. I'm again making a mistake here. Yeah. I should not click on this. Okay. I'm going to skip this on lecture 6 on post-communist societies and lecture 7 and 8 on political cleavages, because I really want to start right away with some sort of substantial finding on which I want to draw your attention now. So let me start with this first graph, which is sort of a very naive and simplistic way to look at inequality in many ways, because inequality, and it's always multidimensional, and you have to look at many other features, and cannot be summarized like this with one number. But still, it's sort of useful to put some of the findings in perspective. So here we have on this graph a very simple indicator of inequality, which is how much of income, or if you want production, wealth produced in a given year, goes to the top 10%, so the people who have the highest level of. Now, of course, if you had complete equality, it should be 10% because they are 10% of the population. If you had complete inequality, it should be 100%. So in the real world, well, it's always in between 10 and 100. But the important point I want to stress is that it can go quite far. So here, this is the whole set of countries for which we have data. So the most egalitarian would be Sweden in 1980, where you would have a little more than 20% going to the top 10, which means, what does it mean? It means that the top 10, on average, they have an average income which is about twice as large, or 2.2 times as large as the average. And this is why they have 22% of total income instead of 10% if they had average income. And the most, so you still have inequality in Sweden in 1980, because, if you go to the bottom 50% or the bottom 10%, you would have people at the minimum wage, who would have less than half of average income. So between the top 10 and bottom 10, you will still have a gap of 1 to 4, 1 to 5. And if you take the top 1 or top 0.1, you will have gaps much bigger. So it doesn't mean full equality, but it gives you a sense of how unequal is distributed. Now, at the other extreme, the most extreme inequality, societies that we have will be Haiti, so Saint-Domingue in 1780. So, which was the most extreme example of a slave societies you can think of, because at this time, in Saint-Domingue, you had about 90% of the population was made of slaves. And from the accounts that we have from the companies of the time, you can sort of estimate that, roughly speaking, the slave, the value of the food and clothes and the cost of the slave for the slave owners will be around 20% maybe of the total output, the total monetary value of the output of the island. So in effect, 80% will go to the top 10. That will be the highest possible level that you could find. Now, so in between these two extremes, there's a whole graduation. What I want to stress here, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in what follows, is that colonial societies like South Africa or Algeria or French Algeria in 1930, of course, are much less extreme than the slave society, and just looking at this extraction ratio does not, of course, do justice, to the violence of all the kind of interpersonal relation and power relation that you can have in these societies. But in terms of total extraction, it's not completely uncomparable. Well, it's less extreme. So, South Africa under apartheid in 1950 would be a society where the fraction of white population would also be of the order of 10%, 10 to 15%. And from the data that we have for the period, the white population, the top 10, if you want, will take a little bit more than 70% of average. For French Algeria, while the white population or the European population is also of the order of 10 to 15% under colonization, and we've been using with Denis Cognot and other co-authors colonial data recently, and you get something like between 65 and 70% for the top 10% group in Algeria, for the settlers group in Algeria. And now, if we look at modern societies, the inequality level are typically less extreme than in colonial and slave societies, which you would expect. But still, you have an entire graduation. Countries like Brazil today or the US today, which have a strong legacy with slavery and racial inequality, are among the most inegalitarian. But this is not the only factor. If you take, the Middle East today, it's very unequal because of, in a way, much more modern capitalist factors, which have to do with the geography of oil ownership, the fact that oil resources are concentrated in very small territories with very small population, partly due to colonial boundaries, partly due to the power struggle between the different dynasties and political regime, etc. So in the end, there's no legacy of slavery in the Middle East, or at least not in the recent centuries. But you have a sort of extremely chaotic and unequal region for a completely different set of reasons. Europe in 1910 is very unequal for different reasons, through a certain organization of the property structures, the voting system. I mentioned the case of Sweden, or the constitutional system that will prevent redistribution from happening, or the ideology. In a country like France, for instance, we have to wait until the summer of 1914 to have the majority in the Senate accept the idea of creating an income tax, a progressive income tax. Although inequality at the time in France was very high. Let me move to the next slide. You have the distribution of income in France in 1910. You can see how the bottom 50% had a very small share of total income as compared to the top 10%. But at the time, the French Republican elite does not want to create an income tax, and you have to wait for the summer of 1914 for the Senate to block the creation, to stop blocking the creation of an income tax and to accept the creation of an income tax. And this is not to pay to invest in schools. This is to pay for the war with Germany. This is the only thing that convinces the Senate to vote the income tax. And one of the key arguments of the French Republican elite at the time is to say, well, look, we have made the French Revolution, so we are already a country of equals, as compared to Britain or Germany or all these other countries around them, which still have to learn about equality. We have already made equality real, and therefore we don't need progressive taxation. And it will take enormous political fight, and to a large extent World War I and the Great Depression, World War II, to sort of change completely the dominant view about progressive taxation and create social security, etc. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but before, I want to again to stress the fact that France in 1910 was an extremely unequal society, but the colonial and slave societies, it was an order of magnitude. So you can see Algeria, you can see Haiti in 1780. So this is again to illustrate the fact that you have graduation in these different distribution of resources. And I think looking at these orders of magnitude, is meaningful. It doesn't mean that the numbers are exactly right in all detail. All these social statistics are always very fragile construction. But I think looking at this order of magnitude in order to compare different societies is important. In particular, if you want to see, so to understand the level of inequality in colonial societies like Algeria, where you don't have, so in Haiti, you understand pretty well why it's very unequal, because you have slavery. So in Algeria, why is it so unequal? Well, in fact, even though you don't have slavery, you have a lot of legal discrimination, racial discrimination, including in, and that's what I would like to stress, in access to education. So here you have so this comes from the work by Denis Cognot and other works that I have done in the case of France. This looks at the concentration of educational resources in different settings. So first look at Algeria. So this is in 1950. The War of Independence are almost started, and the French authorities are supposed to make some effort, to make colonialism look a bit better. But in fact, what's happening is that if you look at basically the children of settlers and the children of Muslim Algerians, as they are called at the time, don't go to the same school. And, sometimes in France, we imagine that the segregation is an issue with the US and that the US South had racial segregation, which is true, of course, until the 1960s. And that this is something that France has never known. But, of course, this is completely wrong. In fact, in the French Empire, and, Algeria is not further away from Paris than is Louisiana from Boston, you have actually racial segregation and very violent racial segregation until the very end, until the war. And this has very practical consequences for the life of children, in the sense that they don't go to the same schools. Okay, so you have schools for the children of Europeans, mostly French, and you have schools for children of Muslim Algerians. And if you look in the budget where the money goes, this is what you find. So you find that, in fact, the total budget given to the school of Europeans and high school and taking everything into account will take up more than 80% of the total budget. Now, this is paid for a taxation system, which is itself very regressive, which relies mostly on indirect tax, consumption tax, which are paid by the majority of Muslim Algerians. So this is what I summarize as, colonies for the colonizers, in the sense that you have a tax system which taxes the local population very heavily, and you use the money to pay for public services. Now, this is pretty extreme, and you can see why, of course, education is at the core of individual emancipation, but also at the core of economic equality and inequality. And this is going to reproduce an extremely unequal situation, pretty much like in South Africa under apartheid, a bit less extreme, but it's a matter of degree more than a matter of absolute difference. I have put in comparison the distribution of educational resources in France 1910 and France today. So this is always measured in the same manner. I look at a given cohort of children. I look at the top 10% of children who receive the most educational investment. So today that would be children, going for master degree, not necessarily at EHESS, but you have French Grande École, which are engineer school, which are class préparatoire, which are even better finance. And the bottom 50% today will be people who don't go to higher education, who only get primary or secondary. So what it means to be in the bottom 50, top 10, of course, doesn't mean the same at different time period, but in the end, this is, I think, the most comparable manner, to make this, to compare these different societies. And let me make a general methodological point, is that, of course, at some level, every society is completely unique and it cannot be compared to others. France 1910, France 2018, Algeria 1950. But I think it's still useful to try to do our best, we're trying to make this kind of comparison, because what we see in this particular instance is first that, the level of school segregation and educational inequality is absolutely enormous in a colonial context like Algeria, but that, that doesn't mean that France 1910 or France today are very equal places, because, remember, France 1910 was a place where, most of the population would only go to primary school, and only a small minority would be able to go to high school or university. And even today, you see, the top 10% share seems to be smaller than the bottom 50% share, except that the top 10% group is 5 times less numerous than the bottom 50%. So in fact, this means that in terms of public resources, given that their share is less than twice as small, it means that the average resource get is 2.5 times as large. So if you want to look at actual numbers, the top 10% children in France who will go to Grande École or preparatory class will receive in public investment between 200,000 to 250,000 euros throughout their school trajectory from primary school to higher education. The bottom 50% children will be people who would leave school at the age of 17 or 18, would have a public investment of 60,000 to 70,000 euros. So there will be a factor of 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 between the two. So this is very far from being from being egalitarian, but this gives you a sense, in contrast, what the situation was in colonial Algeria or in France in 1910. So, all of these societies are very unequal, and including, of course, today's French society in many ways. But it's not the same, structure, and trying to understand how we get from one to the other, through which political process we get to one to the other, is very much, what I'm trying to do in my research. Let me, to conclude, show you a little bit of the findings for the more recent period. So if we look at the recent decades, we know, there's been a big rise of inequality in the US, also in Japan and Europe, which are the two other parts of the rich world, so to speak. But you can see that, in the US, it's been a lot bigger. Again, if we want to explain this evolution, if we only look at economic factors like, globalization, we are not going to go very far, because globalization, happened not only in the US, it happened in Japan, it happened in Europe. So, this kind of story which you hear sometimes among US economists, that's globalization, there's nothing we can do about inequality. Well, I think is not very strong, because, you have this huge variation between countries, which you want to explain using other explanation, using different political factors in particular. So just to take two examples about political factors, one about taxation and the other one again about education, which is of course very important. So this is the evolution of income tax progressivity over the course of the 20th century. So here, it's a very simple indicator, which is the top income tax rate. So this is the top tax rate applying to the very highest income. And this is again an issue Romain knows a lot about, has written about tax resistors and the fact that, this is an evolution which didn't come easily. It's not as if there was unanimity in the United States to create this very high top tax rate, but sort of it happened. You can see that the US in blue was the very first country. So in the US, the income tax was created in 1913. So it's only 1 year before France, 1914, but it's very different because it was not to pay for the war. It was 1 year before the war, and it was the outcome of a very long process of constitutional revision, which had started almost 20 years before in 1825. And as you may know, it's very complicated to change the US Constitution. So, you took a big, enormous popular mobilization at a time where rising inequality was a big concern in the United States. And in particular, this can seem very strange to us today, but at the time, one of the big fears in the US, around 1900, 1910, 1920, was that they didn't want to become unequal like in Europe. They had the feeling that American democracy was based on equality, at least equality among the white, and if we have too much concentration of wealth, we're going to become a plutocracy, and we don't want this to happen. And in effect, what they did is to lead the way toward very progressive taxation. So you can see the spike in blue in 1918. 77%. This is the top income tax rate in the US in 1918. This was only 7% in 1913 when the income tax was created, and it jumped to 77%. Under Roosevelt, it went up to 94%. In Britain, sometimes it was even 98%. Now in Europe, France and Germany, it was usually less extreme, except you can see Germany in orange. But you have 90% between 1946 and 1948. But in fact, this is not Germany. Well, this is Germany, but this is the time Germany was occupied by Western power. And this is time where, in fact, the tax rate were picked by the Allied Control Council, which in practice was ruled by the US authorities. And so after Germany took back its sovereignty in 1949, they quickly reduced their top income tax rate because they didn't want this crazy American level of 90% to continue. And the Americans did the same in Japan. I don't have Japan in this graph, but they did the same in 46, 48. And, this was not to punish the wealthy Germans or Japanese who had done very bad things, although, of course, they had done very bad things, but this was not to punish them, because this is what US authorities were also doing at home with the wealthy Americans. So, in fact, this was viewed at the time as part of the civilization package, so to speak. You bring democracy, you bring electoral institutions, or this is the way the Americans will view their role, together with the fiscal institutions that will prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy. So this can seem like ancient history to us today, although, with Biden, some people feel that, maybe the US may be sort of returning to a kind of Rooseveltian inspiration. I think we're still far from there, but we can talk about this if you have questions. But the bottom line, and this is where I'm going to stop, is that we need history, not only because history is very interesting in itself, but because this is part of our legacy. This is not so long ago, and so this thing changed. Countries have to invent new narratives, new funding myths, new funding stories about who they are, where they come from, where they want to go. And this involves changing views about the right level of equality or inequality, the right institutions. And this is going to continue. This is going to, people who believe that today's tax system or political or economic system will never change. I think we should not be impressed by this kind of statements, and what we learn from history is that these things can change sometimes much faster than what we typically imagine. So let me maybe stop there so that we have time for discussion and for questions. And I had a few other slides that I have planned for presentation, but which I am sure I will find a way to use them during the questions if necessary. So thanks a lot to all for your attention, and Romain, I think it's now up to you.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, for your great presentation. So now it's time for the Q&A session, questions and answer. So you can either ask your questions in the chat or ask them directly to Thomas in French and English, whatever you want. I think we can translate. So the floor is yours.
Okay, I am sorry, I'm on my mobile and apparently doesn't want me to use the video. Apologize for that. So I'm a lecturer in international political economy, but an international historian by background. So I wanted to ask Thomas whether he thinks a Gramscian approach would be particularly helpful. You mentioned the importance of examining the ideas circulating at a given moment, so in a historical perspective. So I was wondering whether including in our analysis and explanations the mainstream dominant economic ideas or ideas about development and inequalities at a given stage will be helpful in allow our students to have a more complex understanding of the matter, and B, possibly allow them to change the mainstream views and so contribute to shaping a less unequal society. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think this Gramscian perspective is absolutely necessary, and it's definitely part of what I am trying to do. I think the general message is that ideologies are very important, and indeed, dominant views about how the economy works, what kind of policy is acceptable or not, are very important. So if you take the example of progressive taxation, which I have shown you a minute ago, for a very long time throughout the 19th century, the dominant view was progressive taxation is bad, it's impossible, it's going to destroy the economy. And then suddenly, at the time of around World War I, in a few years, there's sort of a diffusion of a new sort of dominant views, and many countries in the world are going to do this. And then after the Reagan transition around 1980, of course, you have a dominant view that sort of spreads in the other direction. And so yes, that's definitely part of what I'm trying to study, trying to understand the reason for that. So if you take the example of the Reagan transition, I think it's a very it's a multifaceted process where, of course, there was an electoral strategy sort of work, with the tax revolt in California in the 1970s, or everything we know very well. But I think there's also a more long-run underground, work by, including by economists, Milton Friedman, Hayek, etc. Of course, but also, group of bank economists, like economists or experts, working in the Luxembourg, mutual fund industry or in Wall Street institution, which sort of work to prepare, the kind of transitions that we had in the 1980s, for instance, regarding free capital flows without any common taxation regulation, which in the end was probably the key institutional step which made the Reagan and Thatcher tax cuts very durable, because made it very difficult for a reversal to take place. And, this involved many different groups that contributed. Some of them, sort of knew very well what they were doing. Some of them, in the context of, European monetary unification and including the Socialist Party in France, I don't know if they were aware of everything they were doing, but so you have different groups, and the way a new sort of cultural hegemony or new ideological dominance happens on specific institutional issues. And of course, in this example, these are specific examples, but these are very important belief system, but very important part of the economic and capitalist and tax system. I think we need to look at this very much through these lenses. So I hope this answers your questions, at least in part. I'd be happy to talk more about this.
And my question is related to my topic, and I'd be very interested to know what you have to say about inequality and health, in particular with regard to access to healthcare, and maybe also just the definition of health and what health is and how this changed maybe in the last 2 or 3 centuries. So I know that's not the center of your research, but maybe you came across this topic, and I'd be very interested to hear your input on this, of course, very relevant topic, but it doesn't have to have anything to do with epidemiology or epidemics. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I would like to hear you and us. I think you probably know more than I do about this. And let me simply say this. What's very impressive in the development of public investment in education and health throughout the 20th century, and is that, well, first it had a huge impact on the reduction of inequality in general. This was, these 2 items, investment in education, investment in health, were probably the most important source of human progress in general. What's very striking also is that, today, I think everybody looking at the historical evidence we have, will conclude that a public health system like we have mostly in Europe, is not only more equitable, but to a large extent, more efficient, and is working better than a system based on private companies and private insurance companies like the US. Now, this may seem obvious to us today, but this is something, well, first, there are still many people in the US who benefit from their private insurance companies and which have, only know this kind of system and who are subject to the propaganda by the lobbyists of private companies, which unfortunately are not aware of that. But if we look at the evidence, this is very striking, and I think this shows one important thing, which is that the rise of the social state across the 20th century has also involved, sort of beginning of sort of decommodification, at least for certain areas of activity, in particular in education and health. And to some extent, this is the same. For in education, nobody almost nobody would propose to have a private capitalist system with shareholder companies in schools or universities. Well, you have, in Chile after 1973, they tried to have some profit-making schools and university, or there was also the Trump University in the US, which was a shareholder company, but it ended up as a complete fiasco for a good reason, which is that the profit motive sort of contributed to destroy some of the ethics and some of the behaviors that teachers and participants to this sort of decommodified sector of production had developed, and this was actually their main asset. And in health, in the health sector, to some extent, you also have this in the sense that the private insurance company in the US or big private pharmaceutical companies, they pay to themselves, sometimes, huge income and profits, which have little to do with the performance in terms of public health that you see in these countries. Now, this does not, of course, exhaust the subject about inequality in health, and there are big issues in the way public health systems are organized, which can, of course, still be very inegalitarian. It's like what I was saying about education before. You can have a public system and still have a lot of inequality in real access to health. And of course, what we've seen with the pandemic is that in some areas we cut the investment and the number of hospital beds, like in France in the past 10 years, and this is something that we are to some extent paying today. So this is a continuous process. Now, one of the key issues, if you look at the global picture, is that the total investment in total public investment in areas like education and health have sort of stopped to increase as a fraction of national income over the past 20 years, particularly for education. In health, this continues to increase because with the aging of the population, it's impossible not to have at least some increase, but it does not increase as fast as it should. And in education, it's not increasing at all, which is, given the rise of a fraction of a generation going to higher education, this is a big problem. And, I think it's a big issue for the future, is that we have to, in my view, we have to accept and find a way to convince others to accept, the need to have a rise in the share of national income that is being nationalized or socialized, which doesn't mean it has to be provided entirely by the state. You have to design a different set of institutions and non-profit, universities or schools or hospitals or whatever, and some kind of decentralized organization involving municipalities, local collective, whatever. And this applies to other sectors as well, in cultural sectors and the media, energy production, local transportation. So it's not only education and health, it's a much more general point, but within this sort of decommodified sectors, which needs to be further developed in the future, health is probably the biggest of all and the most vital in many ways of all. Again, I'm not completely sure, I answer what you had in mind, so don't hesitate, like for the previous question, if we have time, I don't know, Romain, to ask me again, and also just not, if you don't want to ask a question, then just say something about health and inequality and health, which you think is very important in your own research or in your own thinking. I'd be very, very happy to hear about that.
Hi, I'm a medieval historian. Thank you very much for your paper. It's really interesting. So I have a slightly strange question maybe, but what do you think about the role of religion in creating inequality or fighting against inequality? Because historically speaking, I mean, in obviously medieval times, Catholicism very much both kind of had an ideology of people merit what they have in this world, but also a kind of otherworldly message of, you know, if you're sinful, you will be punished in the afterlife, and if you're meritorious, you will be rewarded. So it doesn't really matter. You don't have to have equality in life. So I sort of wonder, I mean, I'm not, you know, that familiar, obviously, with more modern versions of this, but obviously in the United States, religion is still much more important. I mean, what do you think? You know, what is the role in these different regimes of this particular element or factor?
That's a big question. So, you know, let me say, okay, religion, you know, make big statements about justice, about you know, how society should be organized, and what is the role of different groups in societies, and they can, you know, in some instances they can contribute to some form of social harmony or some form of equality. The question is who, you know, what are the mechanisms and the institutional forces and mechanisms which allow people to sort of put these big statements and these objectives under control, so to speak, and under stress, and so, like, you know, you mentioned medieval doctrine about inequality. So in my latest book, Capital and Ideology, I use at some point work by Todeschini on how the you know, the Catholic Church contributed also to develop a system of property law and commercial law with, you know, some restrictions, of course, on you know, interest rate, etc., which we know about, but at the same time, they will be in practice, or at least that's what Todeschini argues, pretty imaginative and flexible in their way to imagine different kind of assets and securities and long-term investment, and sort of, as long as this is sort of controlled to some extent by the church and religious organization, you know, they will be a much more flexible than what is sometimes imagined. In principle, you know, so I talk about that in my class and in my latest book, Capital and Ideology. You know, the church as an organization owns a lot of assets. You know, of course, like in France before the French Revolution, the Catholic Church would own maybe 25% to 30% of everything there was to own in France. So this is an enormous, you know, it's like, it's a little bit, it's the same as the share of total property in China owned by the central state and the Communist Party today. So, you know, I don't want to compare the two religions, but I'm saying, you know, it's, when you own 30% or 25% of everything there is to own in your country, you are not a hegemonic player. You know, you're not like the Soviet state in 1930 or 1950, but you're a very strong player. You are more powerful alone as any single private property owner in the country, and you can sort of impose your views about you know, how schools should be organized, hospitals should be organized, how so, you know, our investment in different regions of China, you know, should be targeted. So this puts you as an organization which is not only about beliefs and about norms, but it puts you into a position to enforce your norms. Now, in practice, did it work? And you know, look, I talk about this controversy. You know, many people at the time of the French Revolution, you know, including Abbé Sieyès, you know, which was on the side of the third estate, but was very upset by the fact that the property belonging to the church, when it was sold, you know, it's not that the government took control of these assets in order to provide better schools or better hospitals than what the church was doing. What the government did was to take control of these assets and sell them to private property owners. So in practice, you know, poor peasants did not own much, and it reinforced the power of property owners, either nobles or bourgeois property owners, a little bit like in Britain after the monasteries were dissolved in the 16th century. It sort of just reinforced the power of private property owners, and this sort of corresponds to the shift from a religious ideology to a sort to a religion of property, so to speak, where we feel that the new elite they become property owners for the only sake of finding the most profitable investment for their property and without any explicit social counterpart. And in the end, it will take a very long time after that, to actually build a school system, health system that would, in the end, work probably a lot better than what the system provided by religious institution was doing. I guess today, one of the big issue. But I'm really making very strong, very general statements here, is that if you have a huge gap between the statements made by the religious structure and the reality, this can create enormous turmoil. And so if you take, I mentioned the case of the Middle East earlier, which I described the Middle East as the most unequal region of the world today in terms of distribution of resources. So if you take the 300 or 400 million people living between Egypt and Iran and Turkey and Yemen, so if you take this big Middle East region, so you have 400 million people, which is comparable to Europe or North America. But if you look at the distribution of resources in these big areas, this is much more unequal than in the US and much, much more unequal than Europe. At the same time, this is the area where you have strong religious authorities, in Saudi Arabia, who say, who make strong statements about religious principles. But then in practice, they have more money, with almost no population, they have more resources than the entire school system in a country like Egypt, where you have 100 million inhabitants, a very young population, and who have basically no resources. So there's such a gap between the theoretical statement of a religion and the reality of how basically they just use the oil revenues to build big building and whatever they want to do with their money and invest all over the world and buy guns and weapons. That I think this is probably one of the explanations for the big reactionary movement around the Muslim religions that you have in this region. So you have lots of people in Iraq, in Syria, or sometimes some people born in France or in Europe, say, okay, we need to change this. We need to create a big state in the Middle East that will take control of all these resources, use them in the name of justice and religion and harmony, and we will stop being humiliated by Western companies, etc. Well, okay, I'm not going to describe you the ideology that comes with it, but I think part of this obviously comes from this enormous gap between strong statements and religious principle and the reality of inequality. So after my book, after Capital in the 21st Century, I received lots of messages by lots of people, but including lots of messages by Muslim readers telling me, oh, your wealth tax is exactly like the zakat in the Quran. So the zakat is supposed to be a tax based on wealth to some extent. And so many people wrote to me and say, oh, this is the zakat, your wealth tax, that's exactly the same thing. And it's exactly what we're supposed to do. And every time, I answered, okay, this is very interesting, but could you send me some material about, some actual historical implementation of the zakat and to see exactly who was paying what and as a fraction of your wealth, or what fraction of the population was paying what. And the problem is that nobody was ever able to send me any material. So this is the point about verification that I was making at the beginning, that it's good to make big statements about the fact that the rich should give some of their wealth to the poor, etc. But it's even better if we have some mechanism and some institutions so that we can check for this and see what's being done. And so I guess sometimes that's missing in religion. But I hope I don't feel too much anti-religious by saying something like this.
Oh, I don't mind anti-religious. I'm certainly not for it. I was just curious what you thought about its impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Next question.
And I've seen your data from the presentation. Every time I see this kind of data that show us the evolution of the inequality during the 20th century, I felt like some kind of hope that things were different and things can change again. But in fact, we must say that the world was very different those times, especially during and after the Second World War, and there was the Cold War and the competition between the worlds between Soviet Union and the West world, and well, the labor world has changed. The world has changed. There are new challenges to face, such as artificial intelligence that will completely change the labor. And nowadays we have the Uberization of the employment, and the algorithm is the new lord. And we've seen recently the case of Amazon, whose employees couldn't form a union. And that's my question. Well, in this new situation, is there a role for unions and political parties yet? And or do we have to find out a new model, a new way to representation and try to reduce the inequalities by these new institutions?
Big question. Thank you, Luis.
Yes, thank you, Luis. I mean, you're right that, between 1950 and 1980, which was sort of the time when inequality in Western countries was at its sort of lowest level. And I think one of the key explanations was indeed the competition with the Soviet Union and the pressure that was put by the Soviet Union somehow on the capitalist elite to accept a certain number of reform, social reform, fiscal reform, and that's definitely part of the big story. Now, well, first, we are not going to recreate another Soviet Union just to have this, because at the same time, the price to pay for the people living in the Soviet Union was quite significant, and also, first, I think we should not idealize too much this 1950, 1980 period. This was also the time of patriarchy, a time where the most extreme level of inequality, of gender inequality you can imagine existed, in particular in Western countries. We should also not forget that this was the sort of welfare state that was built at the time was very much centered on rich countries, and in a way the period 1980 2020 has seen the beginning of a decline of inequality at the world level, between rich countries and poor countries. So that's a lot due to China, but it's not only China. And in any case, the rise of China, it's a complex phenomenon. It's very ambiguous. It has, in some way you can say it is the perfect digital dictatorship is rising, and to some extent this is true. But this is also, the improvement of living conditions and the exit of poverty for hundreds of millions of people, and this is also true. And this is not only China. There are other emerging countries which, in the 1950, 1980 period, which was still the age of colonies, or it was the beginning of the end of colonies, but it took a very long time. If you think of Algeria or Vietnam, or this was a period which was a period of war and you know, in the end, the liberation, but you know, it took a long time. And so the 1980-2020 period, if you look at gender inequality or racial inequality or you know, world inequality, you know, it's a period where you, in many ways you have a more reduction of inequalities than in the 1950-1980 period, which should not be idealized. I mean, it made a lot of things. There was a lot of progress in some dimension, but less so in some other dimensions. And last point I want to mention, you know, you ask about unions and political parties. You know, I think, okay, two points. First, about unions, you know, of course we need unions, you know, I think more than ever. So you mentioned, you know, the vote at Amazon. So here, you know, this is the problem is really that the US institutional setting makes it very, very difficult for a union just to exist in a company, and the possibility for companies, you know, to finance their campaign against union. You know, we've seen also in California a number of recent votes on Uber. So here you have a big problem with the way elections in general are being financed in the US, which in effect, you know, make it very difficult to win this kind of vote. To begin with, I think, you know, the legal system should make it possible for a union to exist even without this kind of 50% vote in a company, because, you know, in many contexts, you know, even in France or in Sweden, you know, if you had this kind of rule that you need a 50% vote for a union to exist in a company, it will be very difficult to get it, because you will have so much pressure by the employer that you very often you will not pass the 50% threshold. So, you know, I think the legal system that we have in Europe or in other countries which have this more pro-union legal system, you know, should really be very careful to keep it or improve it. But you know, that's a big risk. I think, you know, many governments realize today that we need to give a role for unions, and we need to give a role for employee representative in firms, including, you know, in the board of companies. So this is an issue I've been talking a lot in my recent book. But, you know, as you know, in Germany, Sweden, but also in Austria, in Finland, in Norway, in Denmark, worker representatives have between 1/3 and 1/2 of voting rights in the board of companies, which makes a big difference. So in large German companies, you know, you have 50% of voting rights in the board for a worker representative, and you have this as worker. So if in addition, so even if you have 0% capital share, you already have this 50%. And then you have 50% of voting rights for shareholders. And now if in addition, you have a small capital share as workers as a 10 or 20%, this means you can change the majority of vote, and local. If a local government has a share, you know, you have the same. So like in Volkswagen, you know, the Lower Saxony Länder, the regional government has a 20% voting right in Volkswagen. So in effect, together with the 50% voting right for workers, they have the majority. And, you know, it's not working so badly. You know, in France, you know, for a very long period of time, you know, employers and shareholders, you know, were saying, and they're still saying to some extent, okay, we don't want workers on board. You know, we want workers to demonstrate in the street and complain. This is all they can do. But, you know, we don't want to have them on board and we don't want to show them our accounts and our books. That's not going to work. You know, these people are unable to do anything useful if you give them all this information and power. Except that, you know, in Germany or in Sweden, you know, it seems to be working quite well. That in fact, this allows to involve workers in the long-term strategy of companies in a way that is useful, not only for workers, but for the overall social and economic efficiency of the country. And you can see in France, for instance, you know, transformation of the discussion gradually. You know, it's a very gradual process, but more and more people feel okay, maybe we should do the same as in Germany and Sweden. And so in 2013, for the first time, there was a law in France giving 1 seat in the board of companies, but with full voting rights for worker representative. Now many people want to have a second seat or a third seat. In Britain and in the US, you had in the US Congress, last year and the year before, you had some proposal by, so it was more, the left side of the Democratic Party, of course, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, but it was supported by a growing fraction of the Democratic group. They put in the U.S. floor, Senate of the floor of the U.S. Senate a bill proposing to have 40% of voting rights in U.S. corporations for worker representatives. And as far as I know, this is the first time that such a proposal is explicitly put on the floor of U.S. Senate and has such a big proportion of support. So they don't have a majority yet, but I think this is building. And even in Britain, you had Theresa May, which was the previous prime minister before Boris Johnson, who actually supported this. Well, she did not put it to the floor, so maybe it was purely rhetorical. But and they had the Brexit to deal with, so they didn't have time to deal with that. But I think it was not only rhetorical. I think it was also because at a time where you have limited tax money. And it's difficult to raise taxation, or you don't want to raise taxation for ideological reasons, like the Conservative Party in Britain, maybe. Giving more voting rights for workers in companies, it has the advantage that it's completely, it's not costly at all. It doesn't cost you anything as a government. So this can be a way to look more social somehow without paying anything. And I'm not saying this is the best reason to do it, because I think we need both taxation and trade unions. But I think this could be a reason why this is. And now, if this German-Swedish system is extended in the next 10 years to France, Britain, US, whatever, it can become a new international norm. I'm not saying it will happen, but I'm saying it's not all going necessarily in the wrong direction when it comes to the role of unions, and I think that's possible that things go more in this direction. There will be a lot more to say on unions and on political parties also, but I guess we should move on to the next question.
Well, first, thank you, Professor Piketty, and thank you to the École for organizing this. I think it's been wonderful, and you should do lots of them. Second, as a way of background, I long ago student of history and a big bad corporate lawyer for many years, and a friend of the École, and that I helped them set up the Fonds de Dotation for the École, I guess 10 years ago.
Good.
So,
That's good.
so a good combination on all of these fronts. But I think my idea is, I hear your notion of inequality regimes, and in my view, there are two topics. I think it's ideas that are active today in maybe evolving those inequality regimes. And the first is, what is the right balance or compromise between inequality and growth? There's the whole theory that if you go to a completely egalitarian system, you may impact growth, and that would be negative. So I don't know whether there is truth to that argument from the economic standpoint. You also read a lot of people who will say that improving equality actually improves growth. So what is the thinking around that topic, the link between inequality and the growth of the system, the growth of the pie? And the second, which may be a related question and may not be a related question, is the corporation has this risk allocation mechanism of limited liability, which is the members of the corporation will take all the upside, but will tend not to bear the externalities of the downside. And I think that has probably been a motor, or is perceived as a motor, of the growth over the last 100 years. And is that something that has also actually contributed to the growth of inequality? or not? And is that something that should be addressed? People are starting to address it with l'objet social and the evolution of the objet social and the B Corporation in the United States, and all kind of thinking around the topic of how can we make the limited liability corporation contribute, say, wealth or distribute damage less unequally. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yes, two very big questions. Okay, the relation between equality and growth. With the level of inequality we have today in most countries in the world, including in Europe, in the US, and you have even more inequality in Brazil or India. I think going to more equality will actually be beneficial for growth. Now, if you went too far, if you had complete equality, then things could be different. But we are so far from complete equality, and what would it mean, complete equality? People will always have different project in life, different kind of jobs they want to do. So, and making this impossible will be of course completely counterproductive for everybody. But we are not there at all, and with the level of inequality we have today, I think the historical evidence that I know of, suggests that there's no trade-off. We can reduce inequality and without reducing incentives for development. And the basic the basic piece of historical evidence that makes me think this is simply that there's different big sort of historical comparison you can make. If you take the long run view, the level of concentration of wealth that we had in Europe before World War I was not useful. It was reduced enormously by World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, progressive taxation. We never returned to this level. Did it make growth impossible? Of course not. If anything, we had more social mobility, more equality, but also more growth in the post-war period, including in the recent decades than before World War I. In the more recent period, the US Reagan experiment, I think is pretty clear as well, in the sense that, what Reagan told America was, okay, we've gone too far in the direction of equality under Roosevelt. In particular, this 80%, 90% tax rate were too high. We have become too equal, almost like Europeans or Soviet or socialist, and we have to go back to more inequality. In effect, let our entrepreneur accumulate more wealth, and this is going to boost growth. Now, as a narrative, as a piece of storytelling, this was quite powerful in the 1980s, and this worked to get Reagan elected. But if we look at the situation today, what do we see? We see that the growth rate was actually divided by two. So if you take the period 1990-2020, so the 30 years after the Reagan decade, national income per capita in the US has grown at 1.1% per year. If you look 1950, 1990, it was 2.2. And this was not a particularly exceptional period for the US. It was not like European post-war reconstruction. If you take 1910, 1950, it was 2.1. 1870, 1910, it was 1.8. So growth actually, if anything, increased with the rise of progressive taxation and the reduction of inequality. And then it was divided by two after the Reagan decade, which was supposed to boost innovation and growth, but in fact, growth was divided by two. So given the huge rise of inequality and the fact that growth was divided by two, in effect, median income stagnated or even declined for, if you look at the bottom 50% income. And I think, so, to me, this is clear evidence that, the level of inequality we've reached today in the US is not useful. So, the kind of concentration of wealth we have at the level of billionaire in the US today is just not useful, given the stagnation of wages and income in the US. I think this has been a disaster, and I think this largely explains, the sort of chaotic situation of U.S. politics today, where the Republican Party, cannot be Reaganian anymore. They cannot tell people, okay, globalization is going to work great, tax cuts are going to run great, your incomes of you middle-class America, lower middle-class America is going to rise like never before, because this is not what middle-class America and lower middle-class America has seen. So that's largely explained why Trump and large segments of the Republican Party with him, have turned to a very ethnocentric and discourse of saying, okay, this is all because of Mexican workers, this is all because of China, this is, the rest of the world, has stolen our hard-working, growth from us, and so this in the end, this had huge consequences, negative consequences. Now, you had your second question on limited liability company. So that's a complicated question, but I think by and large, what has been successful in the 20th century was a process by which, the rights and the control rights and the power of property owners has been gradually, not enough in my view, but gradually rebalanced with the power of wage earners, trade unions, local municipalities, government, all set of actors which prevent shareholders to do what they want, especially when they have limited liability. It can be good in one aspect, but of course, if we don't properly measure the negative externalities that they exert on the environment and all sorts of other dimensions, this limited liability can become just a right to accumulate profits and let the damage to others, which is not good at all. And if we go back through time, the first shareholder companies were even worse. The very first shareholder companies, the East India Company or the Dutch company, were really gangsters, basically. They ran private armies. These were just, sophisticated gangsters and sophisticated. Well, this was just another name for colonialism, which was just privatized to shareholder companies to begin with. So as compared to this kind of shareholder companies, of course, over the course of the 19th century and even more so 20th century, the rights of these shareholders have been regulated quite heavily. They cannot run a private army anymore in India. They cannot. But there's still a lot more to do, I think, in this direction. So you want to keep the flexibility and the decentralization, but you want to limit the abuse of power, and you want to involve more people, I think, in decision-making process in companies. And this brings us back to the previous questions about participation by worker representatives, which I think is very important. I think you have thousands and tens of thousands of workers and engineers and whatever, and the view that, one individual, because he or she funded Facebook or Amazon or SpaceX or whatever, will be, able to take decision on his own for the next 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. It's a sort of monarchical view of economic organization and economic power, which I think is completely out of touch with the reality of our societies, which are, very educated societies where thousands and millions of people should be able to participate to decision making, including corporate decision making.
Thank you, Thomas. I think we have time for one last question.
Thank you very much for this engaging presentation. PhD student, and I conduct my research in Kototel at ETHE in Budapest, Hungary. and at the EHESS in Paris. And my question relates more to the first part of your presentation concerning the current mainstream French academic setting and the study of economic inequality in France today. Because you highlighted that in your university program on inequality at EHESS, you put a considerable emphasis on history, on economic history, but also social history, cultural history, etc. That is, that you highlighted the important role of extra economic factors in the making of inequality. When you also highlighted that we should use macroeconomic models, but with parsimony. This remark suggested to me that your program is out in France in this regard, because maybe, I do not know, this is my question in fact, because maybe it is not a general pattern among French schools, taking into social, cultural, and other factors into account while studying economic inequality. And so I'm interested in this like general pattern followed by French schools. Is the approach that you adopt somehow particular or idiosyncratic in the French academic milieu, perhaps?
Well, I think we're very lucky again at EHESS that we have this this freedom and this possibility to organize things this way. So I think it's not unique, but it's indeed maybe not so common in France or at the international level. That being said, let me mention the experience. I visited a couple of times a new International Inequality Institute at the London School of Economics, which brings together people from pretty much every department at LSE, with the exception maybe of the economics department. So you have people from sociology department, urban studies, political science. There's an economic history department which is separate from the economics department. There's whatever geography. Lots of departments which participate to this institute, Inequality Institute. They have a master program, and I've been there a couple of times, and I was very impressed by the sort of way people could speak to one another. In practice, of course, what's difficult is that students, PhD students, after they're done their PhD, they need to find jobs, and here choosing an academic discipline can be useful, and here things can get complicated. So when it's at a master level, people do all sorts of things after their master, and I think pluridisciplinarity is not only possible, but it's actually very useful for many jobs you do in international organization, in whatever, private, public sector. Well, if you do your PhD and you're looking for an academic position, then at some point choosing a discipline, unfortunately, is useful. And this is something that I regret personally, because very often some of my students, when they do their PhD, I end up to encourage them to do things which are sort of much more economic focused than I would like them to do. But I sort of know that this would not help them so much, if there were too interdisciplinary, because then, well, economics department will not like them anymore. And probably history and sociology department will find that they are not sufficiently into the history or sociology curriculum. And so in the end, they will be lost. And so that's difficult. It's easy for me as a faculty member, and I can do what I want. Nobody, and especially at EHESS, but generally speaking, I am in a position where I can. It's relatively easy to say, okay, we don't care about the discipline and we don't care about the frontiers between. But for PhD students, that's much more difficult. And so at some point you have to choose whether a student wants a job in an economics department to begin with, or wants to go to a sociology department, political science, history, and then the game is different, and what is expected from you is different. So I have to, we have to take this into account, unfortunately, sometimes, but that's part of, the institutional game and setup in which we all are.
So maybe Yes, we can have one last question.
Good afternoon. I am from Peru, and I have two very small questions. My English is really so very bad. Mr. Piketty, could you tell me about something, the election in Peru and the family Fujimori? And what about you happenings now in Colombia?
Yeah, I'm afraid, Fujimori family, I'm afraid you know more than I do about this, and I don't want to, to talk about something I don't know enough about. About Colombia and, the demonstration and the violence that we've seen in the recent days in Colombia, this is really very, very, very sad, very frightening. And, I think from what, I can see, this is probably the first example so far, one of the first example of a sort of post-COVID social crisis, which, of course, comes in a country that is, very, very unequal. I mean, generally speaking, Latin America is, of course, one, the most unequal continent in the world. But, what I would like to stress is that although you have a general pattern of high inequality in Latin America, you do have lots of variations. And it's very striking to see that, well, Colombia belongs to the sort of high inequality end with other countries, including Brazil or Chile, but like Argentina is clearly much less unequal. So, in the end, politics, institution, different policies can make a difference. Sometimes, in Latin America and in particular in Colombia, you have a big gap between statements about we are going to reduce inequality. All political parties sometimes are called, even the most right-wing are social democratic. And so everybody wants to, and you have in the constitution, you have wealth tax in the constitution, things like that. But then in practice, the way it is implemented and you have very unfair tax system, including in Colombia, where this is part of the protest is going on right now about taxation. And so, in my lab at the World Inequality Lab, we try to put as much pressure as we can on national government tax administration to open up, their data, in particular regarding taxes, so that we can produce, more information, and we can contribute, in our own little way, to bring more democratic transparency to this conversation. I must say, in practice, it's very difficult, in particular in Latin America, where, you meet, sometimes, you meet people who tell you, oh, yes, we're going to open our data, etc. And then, you really have to put pressure, but sometimes through journalists or, academics or, coalition of activists, academic journalists, you are able to get access. So, for instance, there's a couple of Latin American countries, including Brazil, where we were able, in the World Inequality Database to have more information than we used to at the time of Capital in the 21st century. And in Colombia, we've been trying hard to access some of the data with, I should say, with limited success, unfortunately, until today. But, I think democracy and empowerment is key. And it's like, the example I was giving before about the possibility to check the claims that are being made. I think it's very important that, social movement and demonstrations, can not only protest, but sort of set a target and a verifiable target about what more fiscal justice and more social justice could mean in a way that can actually be verified, and if necessary, that can lead to a change in government, of course.
Thank you, Thomas. I think we have to stop here. We're almost done. So it was a very, very interesting Q&A session with a lot of questions, and we still have more on the chat, but I'm sorry, we have to stop. And we have questions about Brazil, about historical precedents of such debates between economists and historians. but I'm sure we can keep you for hours, but I'm not sure you want to stay with us for hours. So thank you very much. I'm sure everybody wants to thank you wherever they are. Yes, we have a lot of thank you. So we stop here. Madame
Okay.
Xu.
Thanks a lot to all. And see you at EHESS maybe one day.